So my name's Paul McGee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. I'm delighted to see you here today and the people online too. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I want to pay my respects to all Aboriginal people present and to acknowledge elders past and present. So it's my pleasure today to be introducing Dr. Ben Stubbs. Ben is a senior lecturer in journalism and creative writing at the University of South Australia. He's written features and literary journalism for the New York Times, The Guardian, the Toronto Star, and many other publications. Ben's long-form non-fiction is published in Meanjin, Griffith Review, Southerly and Inside Story. He's written 5 books exploring travel writing and the boundaries of non-fiction. And I want to just stress that word, exploring. Ben's written some really extraordinary work, including a book that is particularly dear to me, which is the book about travels in Madrid, which is a book-length exploration hour by hour of Madrid by night. And it goes for maybe 200 pages. And in each hour, Ben locates himself in a different part of Madrid. So you end up at the airport at one point, talking to undocumented people who are forced to live in the airport. You end up at a souvlaki bar at another point. At another point, you're in a nightclub. Round about halfway through the book, you find yourself asking, how has he got this energy to all of these places? And you suddenly realize that what you're reading is a composite of many, many nights' investigation. It's a quite extraordinary book in the way that it manages that line between the fictive and the non-fictive, taking you to both places at once. And that's just one example. Ben is a former student of ours here at UC, so I'm also delighted for that reason to be welcoming him. And I'll just pass over at that point.
Great.
Cheers, Ben.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. It's very surreal and wonderful to be here. Like Paul was saying, I started here in the year 2000 as an undergraduate student, and I've been here with many hats on over the years, so it's lovely to come back here and to see places that are familiar and strange all at the same time, and to kind of talk about what I've been doing in the interim. So today I'm talking about, I suppose, the nexus of what I've been doing over the last 6 or 7 years, going from being that traditional non-fiction writer, travel writer, through to being someone who's faced with, as a teaching and research academic, the changing world in which we live in, that simply writing a book or reading a newspaper is not the way that everyone engages with the stories which we tell these days. And so this is kind of charting the journey of what I've discovered, the missteps I've made, the challenges that have come along the way, the ethical quandaries that have presented themselves, and how that's created a really exciting space to research as well. Because if we knew all the answers, then there wouldn't be much fun in that either. So yeah, I'm going to be looking at the expanding boundaries of immersive storytelling through technology today. There we go. Okay, so what I want to have a look at today is around the emergence of virtual reality as an immersive storytelling capability, how we've dealt with that, how we've engaged with that from a research point of view from myself, but then also how we've taught that in a university environment as well. As I've had some discussions with some of your colleagues today, it's one thing to have these grand plans for incorporating virtual reality and storytelling into what you do. It's another thing to start from a baseline of 0 and then expect some sort of competency by the end of the 10 or 12-week semester. I'm also going to be having a look at augmented reality. This is something that I've learned along the way as well, is that technology in the era in which we're in at the moment is something that is constantly evolving. And to have some proficiency in 360 storytelling or virtual reality is all wonderful, but things are changing all the time. The way that others in industry are enacting, are engaging with technology changes. the way that our students, again, understand technology changes. And so this is where looking at new opportunities is a constant challenge and opportunity with what we've been doing as well. One of the things that I'm going to be exploring today as well is that notion of a lack of defined grammar, which is what I call it, around how immersive storytelling is both taught and practiced. Because you'll hear me mention the word gimmick a lot today, that technology affords a lot, but beyond that initial notion of, wow, there's a dancing hot dog on my screen, there often is that lack of story, that lack of narrative, that lack of boundary that allows us to teach it, but then also allows practitioners to shape it and focus it and build on it for other opportunities. And so that's something that we've been looking at and challenged by over the last 6 or 7 years as well. And so I'll have a look practically and theoretically how we've been addressing that as well. I'm going to be talking about Chris Milk in a little while. Some of you may be familiar with his work. And one of the quotes, which is completely ridiculous, but always sticks in my mind when he's talking about virtual reality, is that it's all well and good to talk about virtual reality, but it's like dancing about architecture. It makes no sense. And so that's where, with a lot of what we've been doing, it's around the non-traditional engagement as well, having our papers and research projects and pilot studies, but then also going out and producing the stuff so that we can make those mistakes and understand from the ground how this works and what it means. Okay, my background. So as Paul alluded to, I first set foot on the UC campus 24 years ago as an undergraduate student, and everything is different, yet it's all stayed the same here. And I completed both my undergraduate and my postgrad studies here at UC. In between those periods and after my postgrad, I was a travel writer for many years for the Sydney Morning Herald, mostly for the New York Times, for the Guardian. And I was constantly interested and engaged with, and it was my reason for getting up in the morning and being a creative practitioner, of immersing myself in the world that was different from the one that I knew. And that was what I was interested in understanding how the world works. And this is where it's something that I want to touch on as well today, that I don't think technology is necessarily a barrier for pushing those boundaries, as I was initially interested in doing 20 odd years ago as well. As Paul said, I've written 5 books, and what's always been interesting to me with the books that I've written is, again, understanding how immersing with people in places with different ways of looking at the world can reveal different things, not only about those places we visit, but also ourselves within that as well. So my first book was about the socialist utopian colony in Paraguay. A group of Australians left Australia in the 1890s and went and lived in the middle of Paraguay. And I wanted to understand how they thought of themselves now, what had happened in the interim, what my role as an Australian was coming in and kind of engaging with them in that time. So again, immersing in a different sense. As Paul said, my second book was After Dark, where I wanted to understand that terra incognita of the world in which we live in, the nocturnal perspective. 1/3 of our lives is underwritten, I would say. And so I lived in Madrid for a couple of months and only ventured out after dark. And I created these composite chapters of walking different streets, of going out to the airport and embedding with people who lived there, of going to suburbs that people wouldn't normally go to, or jumping on a bus at 2 a.m. and following it through till it reached its depot, and then getting back on another one, just to challenge that notion of what immersion can do, that it doesn't always necessarily need to have an objective. It can just be exploration. And I wrote, again, more recently, a vertical travel book about South Australia, where I live. It's often a maligned state in Australia. And so I wanted to have a look at that notion of treating the place that I live as if I was a visiting tourist, and that idea of looking beneath our feet, and it being a kind of archaeology where we look at the cuisine, the culture, the histories with a lowercase h to see what we can uncover. And more recently, I've written books about creative writing during isolation, prompted by being a travel writer in the pandemic, and rethinking travel writing, which comes out next month. Again, that notion of being an immersive storyteller in a world where the environmental impact of travel and tourism has come into very sharp focus, and how can the important role of a travel writer still maintain its relevancy. So as it says there, I first began to kind of push against the boundaries of what immersive storytelling could do during my PhD, where Paul in his office in Building 20 would continually throw books at me that kind of forced me to step to the side, to think about what I was doing differently. And that's something that's been really valuable to me in terms of looking at my genre, looking at the area that I know very, very well, but coming at it from a completely different vantage point. And this is where I think that in my university environment, being innovative has become an expectation, but with this idea of immersive storytelling, I don't see that as a negative. I see that as something that we can embrace and that can open up all of these other perspectives, like Paul did for me once upon a time, that travel writing is poetry, travel writing is ethnography, travel writing is history. Immersive storytelling can be many different things as well. Okay. One of my favourite immersive storytellers is Ted Conover, who's written about all manner of different immersive environments, from being a prison guard in Sing Sing in New York through to wanting to understand the plight of people coming from Central America across into the United States. And what he says there is really instructive for what I've been exploring with my immersive storytelling. The point is that by simply spending time with people, being at their sides as they encounter challenging situations, by hanging out, in other words, you learn a lot more about them than you might by only conducting interviews. By eating with them, traveling with them, breathing their air, you get more than just information. You gain shared experience, and often you get powerful, true stories. And for me, it was that shared experience that kind of jumped out at me, that the immersive possibilities of virtual reality in the first instance allowed the complicated role of the viewer to share an experience with the storyteller in a way that they hadn't really been able to do before. And so this is where it was really pushing some interesting boundaries. If we circle back a little bit, as a practicing travel writer, I wrote about everything from Australian utopian colonies in Paraguay to the Afghan history of South Australia, where my ability to immerse my readers in the places I visited, the scenarios I encountered, and the people I met was key to the success of my work. From a teaching point of view, that has extended to presenting the structural elements of immersive, literary, and even gonzo journalism to my students so that they can articulate their ideas using a creative nonfiction framework to transport their readers into the profiles, features, and environments they write about. The key here for me is that immersion is an extremely powerful and important journalistic technique that adds a sense of authenticity to the work. The prompt that initially became interesting to me was how this immersion might be transferable across mediums. And one of the things that I think is kind of consistent with all of those writers that I just, grabbed off my bookshelves to highlight examples is that all of them, from Richard Burton through to George Orwell down and out in Paris and London, they were always pushing boundaries with what they did. The reason that they're still relevant, the reason that they still delight and surprise and challenge us is because their work was always challenging what our notion of being in a place, of immersing in a place, might do. And this is where, again, it became something that was interesting and relevant from a technological point of view as well. There we go. Okay, the need for change. So I've been at UniSA for 10 years, and it was after a couple of years that I'd been there that I started to notice a disconnect. I was the youngest faculty member there, and that was neither here nor there. But the journalism that was being taught seemed to be steeped in an era when I was 18 and 19, when I would get the Canberra Times and spread it out over the kitchen table and spend, the weekends, reading every page and flipping over to the travel section and doing the same with the Sydney Morning Herald. When I looked, and so that's what was being taught by my professors who had this wealth of experience. But when I looked at all of my students, that's how they were engaging with their media. That's how they were looking at their, their stories. And things have changed immeasurably since, in terms of it not just being text, but it being podcasts and social media and things like that. But there seemed to be an opportunity there. And I went to a journalism conference at the end of 2017 where there was a session on innovations in journalism. And there were people from the United States, from Scandinavia, from the Middle East, all talking about all of these interesting, provocative things that they were doing. And when it came to the Australian side of the room, no one had anything to say. And just that, and I was new. This was, one of the first big conferences I'd been to. I didn't want to put my hand up or anything. And it just seemed like an intersection that was too good to ignore. As, I'm sure many of you with works that you've done, when things pop their heads up, when that mole pops its head up, you've got to whack it, or otherwise it disappears and you never know when it's going to appear again. And so that's where I thought there's an opportunity to combine this lack of innovation in the place that I'm working with the fact that my students are doing something differently. The prospects of them being storytellers and journalists in the future is changing. So I did what the journalist in me would normally do, and I just rang the head of computer science at UniSA and just said, "Hi, Bruce, my name's Ben. I went to this conference and I found it really confronting that, and disheartening that this was going on." And they work with defence. They do all of these multi-million-dollar projects that, not many creative writers ever get to see that many zeros on research projects. But he found it fascinating because they always work with the technology. They never worked with storytellers. They'd never heard of the hero's journey or of the 3-act structure or anything like that. And so we started having coffees and we brought in colleagues and we started to talk about how we could create something that was usable by journalism students and by journalists in the future that combined technology and narrative, but it was accessible. And so we went for some internal grants and we started this pilot study. And this was before some of us in the room will know Premiere Pro and the VR add-ons that they've now got. This was before all of that. And so we created a kind of a drag and drop system, which would allow us to start to experiment with storytelling and technology in a new way. As it says there, I wanted to keep storytelling front and center with what I did because that's what I know. That's what makes sense to me. I think too often there are, the bells and whistles of technology and people lose sight of what it is that got them there in the first place. So for me, it was always, what can the computer scientists bring and what can I bring so we can meet in the middle somewhere there? That notion of showing rather than telling with technology, using structure to create a beginning, a middle and an end, and to use a hook so that, again, there's a reason why people are engaging with our stories. And this notion of immersive storytelling using technology has leaked all over everything that I do now in terms of my practice, my research, my writing, to think differently about, this changing world in which we live in. And so this is how it all began. Let's jump back a little bit though. The earliest examples for those of us who haven't grown with VR, the earliest examples of an enhanced visual experience with stereoscopic images have links to the handheld wooden viewers of the 19th century. These devices created the illusion of depth and dimensionality through photos of the same scene taken at slightly different angles being inserted into a viewer. And some of us would remember these from the 80s, those red panoramas where you could see the Golden Gate Bridge and things like that. This idea became more mainstream in the 20th century when, in 1982, games production company Atari began research into virtual reality dissemination, though the associated costs and small adoption rate meant that it was quickly abandoned. In the 1990s, VR machines were a feature in many gaming arcades in the Western world on the back of the 92 film The Lawnmower Man, which utilised VR technology. During the same period, games producers Sega and Nintendo both had failed ventures looking to bring virtual reality into the mainstream once again. And this is kind of where it left us when we entered the field. One of the things that has been a constant with that evolution, with the Lawnmower Man, I'm not sure if you all went to games arcades in the 80s and 90s where they'd have these gigantic VR machines where you'd step in and it would be these clunky pixels and you'd engage for, $10 for 4 minutes and things like that. But gimmick has always been part of what has gone before, and I think that it's always part of what's there at the moment. And this is where that structure, that grammar is very important. One of the examples that I came across while I was doing my research was this notion of smell-o-vision, of this this idea of combining the sensory profiles into a visual experience. And Hans Laub created this, machine that allowed smells to synchronize with what was going on the screen. There's a wonderful YouTube video that you can find of them enacting that in a cinema, where the femme fatale comes onto the screen and, the rose perfume comes through, and then the man, we're looking through the shutters, and then the audience gets a waft of cigar smoke and everything. It's got wonderful potential, but the way that it was being done with the ushers and everything, it still had that gimmick factor to it without it being long lasting. So it was cool without being enduring. Okay, so with what we're doing, we decided to go down the 360 camera route with what we were doing for achievability in the classroom setting, budget concerns, and the ability to appeal to our first cohorts and their skill sets. There's absolutely an opportunity to expand this to mixed cohorts of computer science and writing students to engage in true VR in the future. But one of the things we had to think about was what was achievable. As it says there, virtual reality as we practice it and teach it is viewed using a head-mounted display. You will have seen the Meta Quests, the various iterations of them throughout the years, from cardboard headsets through to the Apple Vision Pros that are coming out. And this is where, again, we had to make some dispensations with what we were doing, where true VR might allow you to walk around, to interact with the environment with 6 degrees of interactivity. 360 allows you to sit in one space, to look around, and to be immersed in a different sense. As Kath Dooley, who's now part of our expanded storytelling lab at UniSA, said, traditional screen media is typically viewed on a rectangular screen. However, 360-degree projects have no screen edge. The world of the project surrounds the viewer. Again, that idea of immersion coming in right from the start. So what I'd like to show you is one of the films that I'm just going to show you a minute or two, a few little snapshots of one of the most influential early films that got us thinking about the power of immersive storytelling and journalism, the problems that it raises, and how we could kind of have our own input into this field as well. So I'll just show you a little bit, and then I'll give some context. It's going to work. Let's hope.
We walked for days crossing the desert into Jordan. The week we left, my kite got stuck in a tree in America. I wonder if it is still there. I want it back. My name is Sidra. I am 12 years old. I am in the 5th grade. I am from Syria in the Beraa province in Helsinki. I have lived here in the Southerly camp in Jordan for the last year and a half. I have a big family.
Can I use the mouse on that as well? Just to... Okay. There we go. I'm just going to have to go around, but you can see there, that's wonderful that I can click and show you the actual 360 notions of it. So Clouds Over Sidra was one of the first mainstream 360 stories with a journalistic intent that not only grabbed lots of attention, but it also started winning mainstream awards as well. It was produced and directed by Chris Milk, who had made many interactive and immersive art exhibitions previously. And it started to get us thinking about this notion of proximity and scale, where the camera was essentially the viewer's head, and thinking about the affordances and the complications that enabled. From Sidra, Chris Milk has got a very well-known TED Talk, which I'm sure some of you have seen. He called VR the ultimate empathy machine from what it enabled us to do in terms of us inhabiting that space in Jordan with Sidra, seeing her family, seeing her classmates, seeing the world in which she lived in. And I think that that notion of agency of the passive and the active is problematic in terms of thinking about the empathy involved in that. But what it does is that it provokes a different way of experiencing story. And that's where I find it really interesting and still valid with what we're talking about. So beyond Chris Milk and Sidra, the first real development of VR storytelling in journalism came from Noni de la Peña in the US, with a variety of non-traditional experiences which offered viewers the opportunity of a uniquely different level of understanding, contrasted to reading the printed page or passively watching audiovisual material. With de la Peña's first experiences, users could be observers in a crowded Los Angeles food bank line during a medical emergency, onlookers in a scenario outside a US abortion clinic, or part of a streetscape in Syria as a bomb exploded, in order to complicate the role of the viewer in these new forms of journalism. Jones writes that the immersive journalism such as this could offer the viewer the opportunity to become a reporter, to become immersed in a news event and make decisions about what they see and hear themselves. And again, just like Chris Milk provoked the audience, Noni de la Peña has continually done that as well. She's complicated the role of journalism, the role of the viewer, and the role in which we all play within these as well. And I think that there's ethical boundaries in which she does, which she sometimes crosses, but it's fascinating to see that ability to, again, to use technology to do things differently, to not just tell the same stories, to challenge and to, again, to step back and say, but why are we doing like this? Why can't we, push things in a new manner? And I think that she's been seminal in allowing others to push forward with things like grammar and other ideas like that, that allow us to create the boundaries that are meaningful with what we do. So de la Peña now runs the Emblematic Group, and their whole mode is to produce challenging VR journalism experiences, sometimes working with Frontline and other places like that. They also work with technologists to create platforms that are initially, again, free for all to use, to allow others to create immersive stories just with their desktops and a simple camera and a story to tell. And this is where she's kind of democratizing the idea of immersive technology, because again, as some of us would know in the room, it wasn't that long ago that people would roll out a $30,000 to $50,000 immersive camera and saying that, this is industry standard. If you want to do something that's going to be broadcast quality, this is what you're dealing with, this Death Star of a camera. And what Noni has done is made it, again, something that is achievable. It's an interesting aside that one of her first students created the Oculus, which I'm sure some of you know. And so again, that's kind of interesting. Her projects include CGI experiences overlaid with real audio, composite experiences, and game engine engagement. Again, always pushing those boundaries. And this is where I think that she's someone to continually pay attention to. I just want to show you a few examples of what she's done. Let's see if this works again. I don't want to get too caught up in that. I could watch this stuff all day. And you can see from that piece there, whereas with Sidra, we saw that idea of proximity and scale from a very different vantage point, that we were nearly claustrophobic in her room with her, seeing that sense of intimacy, and it was nearly uncomfortable being in her space, in their, their lived environment. And that was done on purpose. And here we get a different notion of proximity and scale, where we see the vastness, we see that bird's eye view. Again, we get that vulnerability, but from a different point of view. And this is where, again, always challenging those boundaries. There's one more that I want to show of hers, which again, this is a really interesting example called Kaya, where they had access to real 911 calls, and they wanted to provoke audience response to the problem of domestic violence in the United States by doing something that wasn't just another written piece, that wasn't just a piece to camera by a journalist that went for 45 seconds and then was forgotten. They used real audio and then created in a game engine the scene in which it occurred. Okay, I don't want to get too caught up in that. So again, you can see there that ethically, she's really challenging viewers. She's using real audio with a kind of clunky, very unreal environment, but it sticks with you. And a lot of the stuff that she's done, it sticks with you. It makes you feel uncomfortable in a sense. And it's how to harness that in a teaching environment, how to make the most of that in a way that we can build on that. So I'm part of the expanded storytelling lab at UniSA, and what we want to do there is not just write about it, as often academics are prone to do, but also how we can do this in a practical sense and in a teaching sense as well. So we're nurturing, we're working with students as they create their own stories as well that are meaningful, that move away from the gimmick of, wow, look at me, I'm in 360, to something that is telling a real story in a different manner. How can we take De La Peña's provocations and create some sort of roadmap for others for the future? So as Kath says, the ethical boundaries and the presence of gimmicks are constant issues with storytelling and immersive technologies. This further highlights the importance of creating a structure for practice so that it can embrace the affordances of the technology while still keeping good storytelling at the centre. So this is where, again, in terms of the journey of what I went through, after engaging with all of this from a removed point of view, Bruce Thomas at UniSA and I got a teaching and learning grant to start looking at how we could create a pilot study for initially journalism students to test this, to see, okay, it's all well and good for Noni De La Peña overseas to be able to do this. How can we do it in a teaching environment where we're constrained by budgets, by enrollment numbers, by technology, all of these sorts of things, and by having expectations of students at the start and at the end as well. So the initial teaching and learning grant, we had 10 students over a semester, and it showed enough promise for me to create the first VR storytelling course, initially only for journalism students in Australia. The course went through the foundations of the medium, the similarities and difference with other forms. These were constant queries. Is it documentary what we're doing? Is it landscape gardening? Is it game design? Is it travel writing? Or is it something else? When we think about that notion of manipulation and engagement, what is it that we're doing? I explored how to use the cameras. And as I was saying to Paul and the others this morning, when we first started, we had one camera that cost $2,000, and I used to have to screw it together with a Phillips head at the start of the lesson. And, again, and then our footage, we'd have to stitch manually in a computer program to get everything together. So things changed so quickly. Editing, structure, the ethics of what we were doing in terms of, again, if you put a camera down in a busy street, what does that mean? If someone can see everything, how does that impact not only the place that you're capturing, but the person, and that notion of claustrophobia, of intimacy, of the story that you want to tell. We looked at everything from choose your own adventure books as influence to Bandersnatch on Netflix, and the evolving interactivity in video games as well as prompts, because this is something different. It does have elements of documentary, but I think that, again, that landscape garden reference isn't flippant, but that notion of creating a hedge or a path that leads your eye up towards a gazebo, that's kind of what we were doing as well. You want the viewer to look over there and then, oh, that's where I'm meant to be looking. And then I'm going to follow the story over there. These were all useful to us in terms of how we were teaching and engaging with this. Okay. So our first pilot study revealed that VR storytelling, when it was done well, was inherently interactive. It was not good enough to simply be passive within the scene. Engaging with the VR experience is demanding of the viewer, and it requires for the producers the examination of three key areas we discovered. Motivation, what compels the viewer to interact with what you're creating? Just because you can look everywhere, why do they want to? Why do they want to look to the left? Why do they want to look to the right? Why do they want to go on that story with you? So how can you build that into what you're doing? You see with Sidra, it seems very simple, but that notion of seeing all the kids walking along the fence, you're naturally going to lead your eyes that way, and then it might lead to a doorway, and then there's a transition to another scene. So these are very simple things, but they, that instruction didn't exist when we started. Action. What role does the viewer play? Because again, journalism and storytelling, there's a lot of passive engagement with story, but this again is something different. Like I said, it's got undefined roles. So what role does the viewer play within the story? And these are things that I prompt the students to answer in their assignments as well. Are you a witness? It's something, it doesn't have to be, a thesis on what your role is, but something like Kaya, like we saw before, where this is an engagement with, the problem of domestic violence. You being an uncomfortable witness in that setting is very powerful, and it's important, and it bridges the passive active, divide in an interesting way. And reward. What's the payoff for engaging in that experience? And again, that's thinking about story in terms of understanding more about a particular environment, about one person's particular story, so that by the end of it, you might realise, I didn't realise that climate change in South Australia was such a big issue, or that homelessness was occurring in this manner in South Australia. One of our early students did a story on a woman who was a PhD student who was also homeless, and they created a story by getting this woman to talk, happily to talk about her story, and then by creating fictional scenes in a car, replicating where this woman lived before she'd have to go and, go through her seminars and things like that. And when you're, like I said before, the camera is the person's head in that car, and you can see your bed and your pillow and your books and things like that, and it's all closed in like that. It does something different to the viewer. It makes them feel uncomfortable and alert to the story in a different manner. This is another example that kind of prompted us to think about what we could do next with the grammar as well.
In August 2017, the Australian government announced a postal vote on same-sex marriage. The queer community have been doing what they can to spread the yes message, but they never wanted it to come to this. In August.
Okay. So with that example that I just showed you before, too many student examples. I'm going to skip ahead. So with that example there, with the marriage vote from a few years ago, the students got in the middle of it. They were in there with the protests and everything, and you felt kind of the whole energy of the protests as they were walking through and being jostled and everything. And then that image down the bottom that you saw, that was the actual piece of paper that people had to vote on, and they kind of finished with that. And that was a really interesting provocation for us of, okay, we watched that, we're immersed, it's fantastic, but what if you had the choice to vote in the story? And so that was really instructive in terms of that active engagement. And so that was one of the things that really led to what happened next in terms of giving agency to the viewer, where they could, in the future, click yes or no as part of what they were doing with the story. And so we discovered, again, some really interesting things from this pilot study. One of them being around that grammar, the structure of the martini glass. When it takes you a couple of minutes to get used to the environment that you're in, to look around, to, what the hell is going on here. The 3-act structure in terms of starting quickly, most of the information being in the second structure and tying things together in the third doesn't work in this environment. You need to give your viewer time to work out what's going on, and then momentum can start to kick in. Also, again, in terms of provoking and alerting viewers to sometimes the confronting nature of stories that non-Indo-European doesn't always do, the inclusion of non-diegetic sound is really important so that people know that this is a construct. This might seem like the real world, but it's, again, the real world, but it's something different. And again, titles to guide the viewer in that sense. Look over here, and repeating them, having them 3 times around the screen so that, again, they don't feel like they're missing out with what's going on. Okay. And these were some of the things that we came up with in terms of the ethic in grammar. These were questions that have prompted us for our further studies. Where does the audience look? Are you manipulating them if you're prompting them to look a certain way, to engage with the story in a certain manner? What happens when you combine narrative and technology like this? And is the end product most similar to documentary, to gaming, or to something else? And does it matter? So the emergence of virtual reality journalism has created excitement and innovation in many quarters of the media. However, with this newness, there are concerns about the classifications of what VR journalism can and should do, what models of journalism it can use to develop its own grammar to ensure it endures as a robust and ethical form of new journalism. Hamida writes that experimentation is becoming far more than just an add-on. It is emerging as a prerequisite for survival at a time of flux and uncertainty, he writes. Hamida states that there are 5 key components for new forms of journalism to consider if they are to endure and add to the stable of current journalism offerings: experimental, experiential, explanatory, emotional, and economical journalism. As part of our study, we've identified the ongoing links with experimental and experiential journalism, along with a clear emotional link due to the immersive nature of the offerings. And so what that led us to, basically, is to create this workflow which allowed students to engage with the storytelling in a more direct manner, creating Immerse VR. I went and spent some time with the University of Texas to look at what they were doing. We won Innovation in Journalism Award from JIRA, which some of you would be familiar with initially, which showed that we were on the right track. And again, it allowed those initial queries that we had to be more deliberate. So this is just a screenshot of the editor that we created so that students could think about structure, could think about interactivity in a deliberate manner, where we would provoke them with, okay, is your story going to be linear, or is it going to be more of a branching tree? And if it's a branching tree, how are you going to curate that experience for the viewer so that it makes sense? And this is where coming back to things like the Choose Your Own Adventure book became really interesting in terms of mapping the story, what your intention was and what the output was, so that it was more than just a gimmick. Okay, I'm going to whiz through these and then we can call it a day. And where we're kind of at with the paper that we've just written and the NTROs that we've produced is that we wanted to create something of that map for immersive journalism. This is example 1. I've got videos of this, which I can show at a later date. But we found that there were 3 basic forms of immersive journalism storytelling in this sense. And these were the kind of the maps that we came up with in terms of the scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, scene 4, but then the importance of using color-coded script writing to indicate how the filmmaker, how the student should curate that. Because again, if you can see everywhere in an environment, how do you make that meaningful? So many of the student assignments early on were interviews with an expert, but it would take place in their office. And so you just felt like you were watching a tennis match going between the interviewer and the interviewee. How can you make that interesting in terms of what it does? The second was the linear interactive story, where using Immerse, we would give a linear story. This one is on stress and young people, but then we would have interactive elements throughout the story where people could select scene 1A, find out more, again, look at some of the data with some of this about the loneliness epidemic or something like that, and then come back into the main story. And so this became a really, powerful use that is journalism, is storytelling, is gamification, is again muddying that passive active notion as well. And then the third one is the non-linear interactive story, which becomes more complicated, where we used a car review as the test case because it just made sense. It's not the most evocative, but in terms of wrapping our head around that map down the bottom, it allowed us to have that initial tree trunk of a story and then all of these branches that allowed you to go in and out depending on if you're interested in the evolution of electric vehicles, if you were interested in going for a drive with the journalists through this particular area. And again, curating your own version of what that story might be. So as a map, it becomes something that's quite interesting if people want to then go and do something that bridges that gap between gamification and journalism even further. And yeah, I'll leave it there. This is a really exciting space. We're now moving into augmented reality and storytelling. I've got some projects with the SA Museum and some community groups. And the next thing that I want to look at as well is video games journalism, where we look at that notion of being an active participant in real world complications and how we can bring in a new audience while still staying true to the tenets of what it is that we are teaching. So I'll leave it there and thank you very much for having me.
Well, that was totally fascinating, Ben. If everyone can wait a sec, we'll open it up to questions and comments.
Thanks, Ben. That was really interesting. A space that I've never been in before. I have a question about, and I wonder if you could explain what grammar means.
That's my term for creating a meaningful structure for what we're doing. So it could be guidelines, it could be framework, but for me, I use the term grammar because it creates meaning in what could otherwise just be a big soup of immersive experience.
Thank you.
Yeah. And again, coming from a writing background, I wanted to have my input into what we did.
Further questions or comments?
So obviously working with these technologies and integrating it into journalism with students that may not be completely au fait with the tech, do you find that they come up to it as a barrier, or is that something that you can easily get them to move past and see the benefit of these new technologies and telling stories in immersive ways?
It's changed. Initially, it was a barrier, absolutely. Having to start from scratch with teaching people the technologies, teaching them editing, filmmaking, all of these things. But what I've found anyway with our teaching environments is that the digital literacy of students across the board has changed amazingly. And so if it's, using a camera, if it's engaging with, one part of technology, it happens like that. One of the things which has been a really positive accidental part of this is that I had to admit more than just the journalism students. So we had the comms and media, the digital storytelling people come in, and that's been wonderful because then a journalism student will combine with a PR student or with a filmmaking student, and they'll bring these different technological capabilities, but also different ways of looking at story. And so that's where the journalism students have been wonderful in kind of grounding it in this is what the story should be. This is where we can't color outside the lines. Then the digital media student will say, but what about if we attach the camera to the side of the car while we're going through and do all these sorts of things? So it's created a really nice environment for experimentation.
Ben, that's such fabulous work. I really, really love it. And I can perfectly see the connection between this mode of storytelling and video games. It's perfect. Does it work for long form fiction or poetry? Yeah.
I think so, yes. And this is I didn't want to bring it in today because I got through 26 of my 50 slides. But we've also brought in the creative writing students as well who want to take it as an elective. And so I allow them to create fictional stories. And that's been really interesting. Just like I was talking about with the notion of the choose your own adventure story, it gives that idea of structure, of storytelling, of narrative, of a plot point a different significance when, one of the ones from last year was a uni student who went to a witch's coven that they thought was just a booze party. And they're exploring this house and understanding what it is, and they can choose to go in this door or this door. And so it became something that was really dynamic. Poetry, I think, would be something that would be really interesting as well, in terms of there's a wonderful journalistic piece called Sanctuaries of Silence, which is a filmmaker's kind of experience of sound and soundscapes and nature against the city. And that to me is very poetic, in terms of just sitting the reader in a forest and getting them to pay attention to things differently, and then the juxtaposition with the city. So I think that poetry could do something quite imaginative with that, in terms of that idea of immersing in a different manner, intentionally, or leaving it open for the viewer to interpret.
Thank you. Very interesting. And this is quite a good example how VR can create a closer proximity for the audience, or the readers in this case, and how it can make the experience more authentic and leading to reflexivity, I guess.
Yep.
My question is, how can you control the physical environment where the audience are actually located, so that they really just focus on the virtual environment? Because I'm thinking the physical environment where they're located can affect their experience.
Yeah, it can. And I suppose that's the positive and the negative of being closed in a headset, is that if the story is well made within that martini glass structure, by the time you've drained the glass, the viewer should be completely immersed in the world, because of the visuals, the audio, the prompts about choice that you create. They're not necessarily thinking about, I'm on a swivel chair in a classroom doing this. Again, that dislocation, which I see all the time when people lift up the headset after seeing a particularly good story, is really interesting.
Sure, but imagine a situation where you're sitting somewhere very comfortably.
Yep.
And it's actually very cold, that the temperature is low, but you're seeing that everything is burning in fire.
Yeah.
And does that reflexivity really happen? I mean, can you really feel?
Well, I think it's something that you could enhance. I don't want to say the word manipulate, but I think absolutely that's something that you could do to maybe go back to smell-o-vision in a more meaningful manner. And this is where I think the boundaries of what Noni de la Peña did are really interesting. So she made an early video about Guantanamo Bay and the reality of people there, and she made people view it in an environment that was kind of walled by cages and had people kind of banging on the cages at the same time. So that external environment impacted how they were engaging with the story as well. And so I think that is an interesting kind of addition, whether you turned the heating up or turned it down, whether when you're watching that glacial piece, if you do set the temperature down to 10, or if you turn all the lights off, and so there's no, external sound coming in at all, and, no one else in the room. It's an interesting kind of provocation. Yeah.
Ben, I'm going to read from behind your shoulder, sorry.
Sure.
A question from online, not sure of the name. That was fascinating, Ben. Thank you. I was wondering if you could comment on engagement with immersive storytelling across generations, whether there were aspects that appealed to different cohorts, or what might widen or narrow engagement among cohorts.
I think it does depend on what's going on in the world, and it depends on the specialization of the student, but that's where, in a journalistic response, responding to that notion of timeliness, which is, again, that's a key thing that I bring up with my journalism students all the time, is really important. So once upon a time, it was about the marriage equality debate, and how can they tell that in a way that's meaningful and provocative. And just as COVID started, we had one where students created a story in an office, and this is just when we started with the interactivity, and they had an office worker who was coughing. And then you had the choice, should you tell the office worker to go home, or do you ignore it and just pretend everything's going to be okay? And then the next scene was an interview with the doctor and talking about, communicable diseases and all of that. And so it's responding to what's going on in the world. I suppose in terms of authenticity, it's also what they can access. So in this case, in South Australia, it would be inauthentic for me if they were trying to do something about what was going on in Ukraine or something like that without being able to provide that sense of place to the viewer. And so this is where it is grounded in where they live at the moment and the world in which they're living in the everyday.
Okay, question from Marianne. Is the technology leading the consumer, or is it the consumer demanding the change?
That's where gimmick comes in, and that's where I think that whole point of establishing a grammar is important, because for me, the technology is just the means to an end. For me, the technology is just the ability to add another layer to our capacity to tell stories. I'm married to VR and AR and all of this now, whether I like it or not, but for me, it's always about the story. So externally, in terms of the promotion of it, the engagement with it, it might be about the cart leading the horse, but for me, without story, there's no point to it. Like I was saying to you this morning, I went to lots of museums throughout Europe last year to look at the AR engagement, and so much of it was just gimmick. It was just a puffy dragon jumping over a wall you look at for 8 seconds, and I used my 2 children as kind of case studies. What did you think of that? And I get the screwed up nose look. Whereas if it's a story that brings them in and makes them ask a question, then that's something else.
Okay, and Alex, and this will be our final question or comment.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the ethics of thinking about this is exacerbating atomization and individual interactions and reactions rather than supporting collective experiences or experiences in nature or things like that? It's that sort of dichotomy.
I'm not quite sure.
Well, you're on your own.
Yep.
You're on your own.
VR
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
I suppose in terms of VR is what I spoke about today, and this is one of the drawbacks of VR is that you are enclosed, you are isolated in that sense. In terms of having a next step, it's about provoking, whether that's the Sidra story or that environmental story, what steps people can take next, in terms of thinking reflectively about the story and the broader theme of what they're doing. For me, this is also where I think that VR can be an imperfect medium as well because of that isolation. And this is where I see things like augmented reality, where there's a more collective engagement with things, as very interesting, because you are in the real world and this story is being augmented in front of you. And so there isn't that barrier of being closed in with what you're doing in that point in time. You are still in the museum with the people coming past, but you're also getting that other story in front of things. So I think I think that part of that is why VR hasn't taken off in the manner in which people hoped 5, 6, 7 years ago. But I don't think that everyone's got the answers in this space either. And I think that that's why it's worthy of further study and why it hasn't overtaken us and it hasn't become like the Minority Report with people with glasses on buses and having pop-ups and things like that. So I think that there's an interesting space, and it will be, again, to see what happens in the next 5 years will be very instructive.
Well, not quite so much seeing what happens. You're in the forefront of actually making good ethical choices, and you're teaching students as well. So it's a real responsibility, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And I see it as a wonderful responsibility. If you don't respond to how things are changing, not just in the world, but in terms of how people access them, then what's the point of being in the position of privilege of being a teacher in a university?
Thank you.
Ben, just a quick addendum to Alex's question. Is there any technical impediment from having 2 people within the same VR experience?
That's something we haven't bridged at the moment. So if I had a bigger budget, you could have avatars in the same experience. So you could have, and that would be fascinating actually, to have that environmental place. And where I was talking about the 6 degrees of freedom, that's where you could have 2, 3, 4, 5 people walking around that same space and looking at deforestation or the impact of a fire, and whether that's talking to each other or you see that with some of the VR chat capacities as well. So it's a bit of a Pandora's box, but an interesting one.
Fabulous. Please join me again in thanking Ben for an amazing presentation.
Thank you.